So in today's video we'll be talking about CSS Grid in general and what it is, explaining it, and just trying to understand it. So CSS Grid is a layout system in CSS that allows developers to create complex and responsive web layouts with minimal code. It's designed for creating two-dimensional layouts, meaning you can control both rows and columns simultaneously. Unlike CSS Flexbox, which is a better one-dimensional layout, either rows or columns, um, yeah, unlike CSS Flexbox, which is better for one-dimensional layouts, which is either rows or columns. So let's look at an example for CSS Flexbox. So if you go into here, you can see that either rows or columns. There's no in between really. It's one dimensional, which is why the grid works better. So back to our grid here, you can see that the grid container, which is a parent element that contains the grid items, to create a grid container where you set the display property to grid or inline grid for inline behavior. There are also grid items, the child element inside the grid container. These elements automatically arrange themselves according to the defined grid layout. Then you have the grid tracks, rows which are rows and columns created inside the grid container. You define the grid tracks using properties like grid template columns and grid template rows. Grid lines. These lines, the lines between each row and column, you can position items based on these grid lines using properties like grid column and grid row. So let's search up some grid tracks so you can see, because it's a new term that we haven't used. Oh, that's GROD. CSS. You always have to specify. As you can see here, these are some examples for grid tracks. So now back to our picture here of what grid is, because it will help us in the meantime. Yeah, we were talking about grid lines. The lines between each row and column, you can position items based on these grid lines using properties like grid column or grid row. And this is grid lines we're just talking about here. Then we have the grid cells. So let's search it up. Grid cells. CSS. As you can see here, these are what you can call no, not here. So to explain grid cells is that the individual space where a row and column intersect, each forming a cell. So as you can see here we have a cell, here we have a cell, here we have a cell. So that's what a grid cell is, and in which a grid item can be placed. So here you can place a grid item, grid item, grid item, grid item. Then you have grid areas. Grid area. So let's use this one right here. Grid areas are named sections within the grid that allow for easier placement and organization of items. So here you have this. This is the sidebar. This is main content and the header and the footer. So then you can start